Bear cub wedged in a pizza oven chimney and took it to hospital. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning air carried the scent of fresh basil and melting cheese through the narrow streets of Millbrook Valley. Behind the old brick pizzeria, 18-month-old Zara Chen sat in her high chair, her tiny fingers wrapped around a sippy cup filled with apple juice. Her mother, Lila, hummed softly while kneading dough at the kitchen counter, completely unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold just beyond their back door. The pizzeria's ancient chimney stretched tall against the cloudy sky, its weathered bricks darkened by years of wood smoke and flour dust. The pizza oven below had been heating since dawn, preparing for the lunch rush that would soon fill the small restaurant with hungry customers. But this morning, the familiar routine would be shattered by an unexpected visitor. Deep in the forest behind the pizzeria, a small brown bear cub named Bruno had lost his way. His mother had been foraging for berries near the river when a loud crack of thunder sent her running for shelter, leaving Bruno confused and alone among the towering pine trees. The little cub's nose twitched as unfamiliar scents drifted through the morning breeze. Something smelled different from the usual forest aromas of moss and wildflowers. Bruno followed the enticing smell, his small paws patting silently over fallen leaves and smooth stones. The scent grew stronger with each step, drawing him away from the safety of the deep woods and toward the edge of human territory. His stomach rumbled with hunger, and the mysterious aroma promised something much more appealing than the bitter roots and tough grass he had been trying to eat. Back in the kitchen, Zara suddenly stopped drinking her juice and tilted her head to one side. Her dark eyes focused on something beyond the window, though there was nothing visible except the brick wall of the pizzeria and the tall chimney rising above it. She made a soft cooing sound and pointed her chubby finger toward the glass, as if she sensed something her mother could not. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lila asked, glancing toward the window. She saw nothing unusual and returned to her dough, assuming her daughter was simply fascinated by a bird or a passing cloud. But Zara continued to stare, her expression growing more serious than any toddler's face should be. Something was calling to her, though she had no words to describe the feeling that tugged at her heart. She pressed her small palm against the cool glass and made another soft sound, almost like a whisper. Bruno emerged from the tree line and approached the back of the pizzeria with cautious steps. The building looked strange to his young eyes, with its smooth walls and sharp corners so different from the curved trunks and natural shapes of his forest home. But the smell was irresistible now, warm and rich and unlike anything he had ever encountered. The little bear circled the building twice, his nose pressed close to the ground as he tracked the source of the aroma. The scent seemed to be coming from somewhere high above, where the tall brick tower reached toward the sky. Bruno had climbed many trees in his short life, and the rough surface of the chimney looked similar to bark. With determined grunts, Bruno began to scale the side of the pizzeria. His sharp claws found purchase between the old bricks, and his strong legs pushed him higher and higher. The smell grew more intense with each foot he climbed, filling his nostrils with promises of food and warmth. Zara watched from her high chair as a small brown shape appeared near the roofline. She babbled excitedly and bounced in her seat, though her mother was too busy preparing for the morning rush to notice her daughter's growing agitation. The toddler's eyes never left the window as the little figure moved across the roof toward the tall chimney. Bruno reached the top of the chimney and peered down into the dark opening. The wonderful smell was strongest here, rising from somewhere far below in warm, inviting waves. Without hesitation, the hungry cub squeezed his small body into the narrow opening, expecting to find an easy path to whatever delicious meal awaited him. But the chimney was much narrower than it appeared from outside. Bruno's shoulders wedged tightly against the sooty walls as he tried to move deeper into the passage. He pushed harder, desperate to reach the source of the tantalizing aroma, but succeeded only in trapping himself more firmly in the confined space. Panic began to set in as Bruno realized he could neither move forward nor back up to freedom. His frightened whimpers echoed through the dark chimney, but the thick walls muffled the sounds before they could reach the outside world. The little cub was completely alone, stuck in a prison of brick and mortar with no way to call for help. Zara suddenly dropped her sippy cup, and it clattered to the floor with a sharp sound that made her mother turn around. The toddler was staring intently at the window, her small face creased with an expression of deep concern that seemed far too mature for her age. "Zara, what's wrong?" Lila asked, moving closer to her daughter. She followed the child's gaze toward the window, but still saw nothing that could explain her daughter's obvious distress. The little girl began to fuss and squirm in her high chair, making urgent sounds that her mother couldn't understand. She pointed repeatedly toward the window, her tiny voice growing more insistent with each passing moment. Something was wrong, and somehow this 18-month-old child knew it with a certainty that defied explanation. Lila approached the window and pressed her face against the glass, scanning the rooftop and surrounding area with growing concern. Her daughter's distress was becoming more pronounced by the minute, and the usually calm toddler was now crying with an intensity that made Lila's heart race. She had never seen Zara react this way to anything before. "What is it, baby? What do you see?" Lila whispered, lifting her daughter from the high chair and holding her close. Zara immediately stopped crying and pointed again toward the chimney, her small body trembling with an emotion that seemed far too complex for someone so young. High above them, Bruno's situation was becoming desperate. The narrow chimney walls pressed against his ribs with each labored breath, and the warm air rising from the pizza oven below was making it difficult for him to think clearly. His small paws scratched frantically against the smooth interior walls, but there was nothing to grip, nothing that would help him climb back to freedom. The little cub's whimpers grew weaker as exhaustion began to overtake panic. He had been trapped for nearly an hour now, and his strength was fading rapidly. The delicious smell that had lured him into this prison now seemed to mock his predicament, reminding him of how his curiosity had led to such a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, in the pizzeria's main dining room, the morning shift was beginning in earnest. Marcus Rivera, the head chef, arrived early as always to check on the pizza ovens and prepare for the day ahead. He was a man in his 50s with calloused hands and a gentle demeanor, known throughout Millbrook Valley for his kindness to both customers and the occasional stray animal that wandered near his restaurant. Marcus noticed that the main pizza oven seemed to be drawing air differently than usual. The flames flickered in an odd pattern, and there was a slight change in the sound of the burning wood that caught his experienced ear. He frowned and made a mental note to check the chimney later, assuming that debris or a bird's nest might be causing a minor blockage. But as he worked, Marcus began to hear something that made him pause in his preparations. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of old pipes or the settling of ancient bricks. But as he listened more carefully, the sound became clearer. It was organic, rhythmic, and undeniably distressed. Back in the kitchen, Zara had become inconsolable. She pushed against her mother's chest, trying to get closer to the window, her small fists opening and closing as if she were trying to grasp something just beyond her reach. Her cries had taken on a different quality now, less like the normal complaints of a tired toddler and more like genuine anguish. Lila felt her own anxiety rising as she watched her daughter's unprecedented behavior. She carried Zara to the window and opened it, hoping that fresh air might calm the child's nerves. But instead of soothing her, the open window seemed to intensify Zara's distress. The little girl reached both arms toward the chimney and made a sound that was almost like a call, as if she were trying to communicate with something or someone. The sound carried across the small courtyard behind the pizzeria, and for a moment Bruno's ears perked up. Through his exhaustion and fear, he heard something that didn't belong to the world of humans and buildings. It was a voice that spoke to something deep in his animal consciousness, a connection that transcended species and age. Bruno gathered what little strength he had left and responded with a weak whimper that echoed through the chimney. The sound was barely audible, muffled by brick and distance, but it reached the sensitive ears of the child who had somehow known of his plight from the very beginning. Zara's reaction was immediate and startling. She stopped crying and became perfectly still, her head tilted at an angle that suggested intense listening. Then, to her mother's amazement, the toddler began to make a series of soft sounds that were unlike anything Lila had ever heard her daughter produce. They weren't words, but they weren't random babbling either. They seemed purposeful, almost conversational. In the dining room, Marcus had stopped his preparations entirely. The strange sounds from the chimney were becoming more frequent and more clearly defined as cries of distress. His years of experience with the restaurant's various mechanical quirks told him that this was not a plumbing issue or structural settling. Something alive was trapped in his chimney. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his toolkit and hurried outside to examine the base of the chimney. The opening where it connected to the pizza oven was too small and too hot to provide access, but he could definitely hear the sounds more clearly from this position. Whatever was trapped up there was in serious trouble. The chef's mind raced through possibilities. A bird seemed most likely, though the sounds were too large and too deep for most species that might nest in chimneys. A cat was possible, but how would it have gotten so far up the narrow passage? The sound suggested something larger, something that had gotten stuck partway down rather than falling from above. As Marcus pondered his next move, he became aware of another sound mixing with the distressed cries from the chimney. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen behind the pizzeria, and it sounded remarkably similar to the calls he was hearing from above. The rhythm was almost identical, as if two creatures were somehow communicating across the impossible barrier of brick and mortar. Curiosity overcoming caution, Marcus followed the sound toward the back of the building. Through the open kitchen window, he could see a young woman holding a small child, both of them facing toward the chimney with expressions of intense concentration. The toddler was making soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed to correspond perfectly with the cries coming from above. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was witnessing. Somehow, this human child was responding to the distressed calls of whatever creature was trapped in his chimney. The connection between them was impossible to explain, but it was undeniably real. The chef approached the window carefully, not wanting to startle the woman or her child. "Excuse me," he called softly. "I'm Marcus, the owner of the pizzeria. I think there might be an animal trapped in my chimney." Lila turned toward him with relief evident in her eyes. "Thank goodness someone else can hear it," she said. "My daughter has been upset all morning, and she keeps pointing toward your building. I thought I was going crazy." Marcus nodded grimly. "The sounds are getting weaker. Whatever's up there doesn't have much time left. We need to call for help, but I'm not sure who handles this kind of situation." As if understanding the gravity of the conversation, Zara made another soft call toward the chimney. This time, the response from above was noticeably fainter, and both adults could hear the desperation in the weakening cry. Bruno was losing his battle against exhaustion and the increasingly hot air rising from the oven below. His small body was cramped and aching, and each breath was becoming more difficult. The voice of the human child had given him hope for a brief moment, but now even that comfort seemed to be fading as his strength ebbed away. The little cub's thoughts drifted to his mother, somewhere in the vast forest beyond this strange human world. She would be looking for him now, following his scent trail through the woods and growing more worried with each passing hour. But the trail would end at the edge of the forest, and she would have no way of knowing that her cub had ventured into the dangerous territory of human buildings and mechanical traps. In the kitchen, Zara suddenly became very still. Her small body went rigid in her mother's arms, and her eyes took on a distant, unfocused quality that frightened Lila more than all the crying and pointing had done. The toddler's breathing became shallow and rapid, as if she were experiencing something far beyond her young comprehension. "Something's wrong," Lila whispered to Marcus. "She's never acted like this before. It's like she's connected to whatever's up there." Marcus studied the child's face with growing amazement. In his 53 years, he had seen many strange things, but nothing quite like this. The little girl seemed to be experiencing the trapped animal's distress as if it were her own, sharing its fear and desperation across a gulf that should have been impossible to bridge. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and the heat from the pizza oven began to intensify. Time was running out for whatever creature was trapped in the narrow passage above, and the mysterious connection between the human child and the unseen animal was becoming stronger and more disturbing with each passing moment. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "I'm calling the fire department," he announced. "They have equipment that might be able to reach whatever's trapped up there. But first, I need to shut down the oven to keep the chimney from getting any hotter." As he spoke these words, Zara suddenly opened her mouth and produced a sound that made both adults step back in shock. It was not a human sound at all, but a perfect imitation of a bear cub's distress call, complete with the distinctive rhythm and tonal quality that no human throat should have been able to produce. The response from the chimney was immediate and heartbreaking. A weak but unmistakable bear cub's cry echoed down from the dark passage above, confirming what Marcus had begun to suspect but hadn't dared to believe. Somehow, a young bear had become trapped in his chimney, and this human toddler was communicating with it in its own language. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at Zara with wide eyes, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Lila clutched her daughter tighter, her own face pale with shock and confusion. The little girl, however, seemed completely unaware of how extraordinary her behavior was. She simply continued to gaze toward the chimney with the same intense focus she had maintained all morning. "That's impossible," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's just a baby. She doesn't know how to make sounds like that." Marcus ran his weathered hands through his graying hair, trying to make sense of the situation. In all his years of running the pizzeria, he had dealt with various wildlife encounters: raccoons in the garbage, birds nesting in the eaves, even the occasional deer wandering through his parking lot. But he had never encountered anything like this mysterious connection between a human child and a wild animal. "We need to move fast," Marcus said, his voice regaining its composure despite the shock. "Bear cubs can't survive long in confined spaces, especially with the heat from the oven. I'm shutting everything down right now." He hurried back into the pizzeria and began the process of extinguishing the fires in his pizza ovens. The flames that had been burning since dawn were quickly reduced to smoldering embers, and the temperature in the chimney would gradually begin to drop. But Marcus knew that time was still critically short. As he worked, Marcus couldn't shake the image of the toddler making those impossible sounds. He had heard enough nature documentaries and wildlife programs to recognize the authentic cry of a bear cub when he heard it. What he couldn't understand was how an 18-month-old human child had managed to produce those same sounds with perfect accuracy. Back outside, Lila was struggling with her own growing sense of unease. Her daughter had always been an unusual child. Quieter than most toddlers, more observant, with an uncanny ability to sense things that others missed. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Zaras seemed to be experiencing the trapped animal's distress as if it were her own, her small body trembling with each weak cry that drifted down from the chimney. "It's okay, sweetheart," Lila murmured, rocking her daughter gently. "Someone's going to help. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Lila wasn't sure she believed them. The cries from the chimney were becoming fainter and more infrequent, and she could see the exhaustion beginning to show in her daughter's face. Whatever connection existed between Zara and the trapped bear cub, it was taking a visible toll on the little girl. Marcus emerged from the pizzeria with his cell phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, this is an emergency," he was saying to the dispatcher. "I have a wild animal trapped in my chimney, and it sounds like it might be a bear cub. I need someone here immediately." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Marcus explaining the unusual circumstances and the urgency of the situation. When he finally hung up, his expression was grim. "The fire department is on their way," he told Lila. "But they're warning me that rescue operations for wild animals in structures can be complicated. They might need to call in wildlife specialists, and that could take hours." As if understanding that time was running out, Zara suddenly became very active in her mother's arms. She twisted and squirmed, reaching toward the chimney with both hands, and began making a series of new sounds. These weren't the distress calls she had produced earlier, but something different, softer, more rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. The effect on the trapped bear cub was immediate. Bruno's weak whimpers grew slightly stronger, and there was a different quality to his responses now. Instead of pure panic and desperation, his cries seemed to carry a note of comfort, as if the human child's strange song was somehow soothing his fear. Marcus watched this interaction with growing amazement. "She's calming it down," he said in wonder. "That little girl is actually communicating with a wild bear cub." The sound of approaching sirens interrupted his thoughts. Within minutes, the narrow street behind the pizzeria was filled with emergency vehicles. Fire trucks, paramedic units, and even a police car had responded to Marcus's call. The small courtyard that had been so peaceful that morning was suddenly buzzing with activity. Captain Rodriguez, a veteran firefighter with over 20 years of experience, approached Marcus with a serious expression. "You called about an animal trapped in your chimney? What kind of animal are we dealing with?" "We think it's a bear cub," Marcus replied. "A young one, based on the sounds it's making. It's been stuck up there for at least 2 hours now, and it's getting weaker." Captain Rodriguez frowned. "A bear cub? How did it get up there in the first place? And how can you be sure that's what it is?" Before Marcus could answer, Zara made another one of her impossible bear cub calls. The response from the chimney was immediate and unmistakable, causing every firefighter in the courtyard to stop what they were doing and stare upward in amazement. "Dear God," Captain Rodriguez whispered. "There really is a bear cub up there, but that sound just came from—" He turned to look at the toddler in Lila's arms, his expression shifting from professional concern to complete bewilderment. "I know how it sounds," Marcus said quickly, "but that little girl has been communicating with the trapped cub all morning. I can't explain it, but she seems to understand what it's going through." The firefighters exchanged glances, clearly struggling to accept what they were witnessing. Their training had prepared them for many unusual rescue scenarios, but nothing quite like this. The idea that a human toddler could communicate with a wild bear cub challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. Captain Rodriguez made a decision. "Rodriguez to dispatch," he spoke into his radio. "We're going to need additional resources here. Contact the State Wildlife Department and tell them we have a confirmed bear cub rescue situation. Also, see if you can locate any animal behaviorists or wildlife experts in the area. We might need their expertise." As the firefighters began setting up their equipment, more curious onlookers started to gather in the street. Word was spreading through the small town that something extraordinary was happening at Marcus's pizzeria. Neighbors peered out of windows, and a small crowd began to form at the edges of the emergency scene. Among the gathering crowd was Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a veterinarian who ran a small animal clinic just a few blocks away. She had heard the sirens and decided to investigate, thinking her services might be needed. What she discovered when she arrived was far beyond anything she could have imagined. "Excuse me," Dr. Whitmore called to Captain Rodriguez. "I'm a veterinarian. If there's an injured animal involved, I might be able to help." "We appreciate that, Doctor," the captain replied. "But this situation is unusual. We have a bear cub trapped in that chimney, and somehow this little girl seems to be able to communicate with it." Dr. Whitmore looked skeptical until Zara demonstrated her ability once again. The veterinarian's eyes widened as she heard the perfect bear cub distress call emerge from the human toddler's throat, followed immediately by a responding cry from high above. "That's not possible, Doctor," Whitmore whispered. "Human vocal cords can't produce those sounds. The anatomy is completely different. Bears have specialized laryngeal structures that—" Her scientific explanation trailed off as she witnessed the impossible happening right before her eyes. Zara was not only producing accurate bear sounds, but she was doing so with emotional nuances that suggested she truly understood their meaning. The firefighters had managed to position a ladder against the side of the building and were examining the top of the chimney. The opening was indeed very narrow, barely wide enough for a small bear cub to squeeze through. But getting the animal out would be much more difficult than its initial descent. "The problem is leverage," Firefighter Johnson explained to his captain. "If we try to pull the cub straight up, we might injure it or push it further down. We need to find a way to give it something to climb on, or create more space in the passage." Captain Rodriguez studied the old brick chimney with a critical eye. "What about accessing it from below? Can we create an opening at the base of the chimney?" Marcus shook his head. "The chimney connects directly to my pizza oven. The walls are thick stone and brick, and they're still hot from this morning's fires. Even though I shut everything down, it'll be hours before it's cool enough to work safely." As the adults debated rescue strategies, Zara continued her quiet communication with Bruno. The bear cub's responses were growing fainter, but they were also becoming more complex. Instead of simple distress calls, Bruno was now producing a variety of sounds that seemed to carry different meanings. Dr. Whitmore, her scientific curiosity overcoming her disbelief, moved closer to listen to the exchange. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "She's not just imitating bear sounds. She's actually having a conversation with that animal." The veterinarian pulled out her smartphone and began recording the interaction. If she hadn't been witnessing it herself, she would never have believed such a thing was possible. The footage might be crucial for understanding what was happening, assuming anyone would believe it even with video evidence. Meanwhile, high above in the dark chimney, Bruno was drawing strength from the strange human voice that spoke to him in his own language. He didn't understand how or why this connection existed, but it gave him hope when he had been ready to give up entirely. The soothing sounds from below made his cramped prison feel less terrifying, and he found himself responding with growing trust. But Bruno's situation was still critical. The narrow walls continued to press against his small body, making every breath an effort. His paws were raw from scratching against the rough bricks, and his strength was nearly exhausted. Even with the mysterious child's comforting presence, he knew he couldn't survive much longer in this trap. Zara seemed to sense the urgency of Bruno's condition. Her communications became more frequent and more emotional, as if she were trying to tell the adults around her that time was running out. Her small face was streaked with tears, though she made no crying sounds. All of her vocal energy was focused on maintaining contact with the trapped cub. Lila felt her heart breaking as she watched her daughter's distress. The connection between Zara and the bear cub was clearly causing the little girl physical and emotional strain. Dark circles were forming under her eyes, and her small body trembled with exhaustion. "She's hurting herself, trying to help that animal," Lila said to Dr. Whitmore. "Is there anything we can do? Some way to make this easier for her?" The veterinarian shook her head helplessly. "I don't understand what's happening well enough to suggest any intervention. This kind of interspecies communication is completely outside my experience. All I can say is that both the child and the bear cub seem to be drawing strength from their connection." Captain Rodriguez approached the group with an update on the rescue efforts. "We've contacted a wildlife specialist who's driving here from the state capital. She has experience with bear rescues and specialized equipment, but she won't arrive for at least 2 hours." 2 hours might be too long, Dr. Whitmore replied grimly. "Based on what I'm hearing from the chimney, that cub is in serious distress, and the little girl is showing signs of exhaustion from whatever she's doing to communicate with it." As if to emphasize the veterinarian's point, Zara's next call to Bruno was noticeably weaker than her previous attempts. The responding cry from above was barely audible, little more than a whisper of sound drifting down through the dark passage. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and murmurs of concern rippled through the gathering. Word of the extraordinary situation had spread throughout Millbrook Valley, and people were arriving from all over town to witness the impossible communication between the human child and the trapped bear cub. Among the newcomers was Elena Vasquez, an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of town near the forest edge. She had spent her entire life in these mountains and claimed to have knowledge of local folklore that most people dismissed as superstition. But as she listened to the exchange between Zara and Bruno, her weathered face grew pale with recognition. "I need to speak with the child's mother," Elena announced, pushing through the crowd with surprising determination. "What's happening here? It's not natural. Not in the way most people understand natural." Lila looked up as the elderly woman approached, unsure whether to welcome another observer or protect her exhausted daughter from more attention. But something in Elena's eyes suggested that she might have answers to questions that no one else had even thought to ask. "Your daughter," Elena said softly, studying Zara's face with intense interest. "She wasn't born here in the valley, was she? She came from somewhere else, somewhere with old connections to the forest." The question caught Lila off guard. "We moved here when she was 6 months old. Before that, we lived in a cabin near the National Forest, about 50 miles north of here. But I don't see how that's relevant." Elena nodded knowingly. "The old cabin by Whispering Creek? I thought so. That land has a history, child. Stories that go back generations about people who could speak with the forest creatures. Most folks call it nonsense, but what I'm seeing here today..." She gestured toward Zara, who was still maintaining her vigil by the chimney. "This little one has inherited something very old and very rare." Lila's hands trembled as she held her daughter closer. "What are you talking about? What kind of stories?" Before Elena could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the forest. A massive female black bear emerged from the tree line, her powerful frame moving with purpose and barely contained fury. The crowd of onlookers scattered in panic, some running for their cars, while others sought shelter behind the emergency vehicles. "Everyone stay calm!" Captain Rodriguez shouted over the chaos. "Do not run! Move slowly toward the buildings!" But the mother bear wasn't interested in the humans. Her dark eyes were fixed on the chimney where her cub's faint cries could still be heard. She had been searching for Bruno since dawn, following his scent trail through the forest and growing more desperate with each passing hour. Now, finally, she had found him, trapped in this strange human structure, surrounded by noise and unfamiliar smells. The bear reared up on her hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall as she sniffed the air around the base of the chimney. Her powerful claws scraped against the brick walls as she tried to understand how to reach her cub. A low, rumbling growl escaped her throat, expressing both her anguish and her growing anger at the situation. Zara's reaction to the mother bear's arrival was immediate and startling. Instead of fear, the toddler showed excitement, reaching out toward the massive animal with both arms as if greeting a familiar friend. She began making new sounds, deeper, more complex vocalizations that seemed to be directed specifically at the adult bear. "Oh my God," Dr. Whitmore whispered, her camera still recording. "She's trying to communicate with the mother, too." The female bear's head swiveled toward the sound of Zara's voice, her ears perking forward with interest. For a moment, predator and prey, wild animal and human child, stared at each other across the courtyard. Then, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear lowered herself to all fours and took several cautious steps toward Zara. Her aggressive posture softened, and the rumbling growl faded to a soft, huffing sound. She was responding to the little girl's attempts at communication with curiosity rather than hostility. "Nobody move," Captain Rodriguez commanded in a low voice. "Let's see what happens." Elena watched the interaction with growing amazement. "She's speaking to both of them," the elderly woman murmured. "The mother and the cub. She's explaining what happened, telling the mother that humans are trying to help." "How can you possibly know that?" Lila asked, her voice tight with fear and wonder. "Because I've heard these stories my whole life," Elena replied. "My grandmother told me about the bridge speakers, people born with the ability to communicate across species. They were said to appear in times of great need, when the balance between human and animal worlds was threatened." As if to prove Elena's words, Zara continued her impossible conversation with the mother bear. The adult animal's responses grew more frequent and more varied, suggesting a complex exchange of information. Most remarkably, the bear's aggressive posture had completely disappeared. She now sat on her haunches like a massive dog, her attention focused entirely on the human child. Dr. Whitmore struggled to reconcile what she was witnessing with everything she knew about animal behavior. "This violates every principle of predator-prey relationships," she said quietly. "A mother bear protecting her young should see humans as threats, not allies. But she's treating that little girl like a member of her own species." High above in the chimney, Bruno had heard his mother's arrival. His weak cries became more urgent, and he found new strength to struggle against the narrow walls that held him prisoner. The sound of his mother's voice, combined with the continuing comfort of the human child's communication, gave him hope that rescue might actually be possible. But Bruno's renewed struggles only made his situation worse. In his excitement, he pushed harder against the chimney walls and managed to wedge himself even more tightly in the narrow passage. His breathing became labored, and his cries took on a note of panic that made everyone in the courtyard freeze with dread. Zara immediately sensed the change in Bruno's condition. Her own breathing became rapid and shallow, mirroring the cub's distress. Tears streamed down her small face as she experienced the trapped animal's increasing panic as if it were her own. The mother bear's reaction was swift and dramatic. She rose to her full height again and began clawing at the base of the chimney, her powerful paws scraping deep gouges in the old mortar between the bricks. Her huffing sounds became more urgent, clearly indicating her understanding that her cub was in immediate danger. "She knows he's running out of time," Elena translated, her voice filled with emotion. The little one is telling her that the human rescuers need more time, but the mother can sense her cub's weakness. Captain Rodriguez made a quick decision. "Johnson, get on the radio and see if we can get a helicopter with specialized rescue equipment. I don't care what it costs. We need that cub out of there now." As the firefighter hurried to make the call, Dr. Whitmore noticed something troubling about Zaras' condition. The little girl's skin had taken on a pale, almost grayish tinge, and her small body was trembling with exhaustion. The effort of maintaining communication with both bears was clearly taking a severe physical toll. "I'm worried about the child," Dr. Whitmore told Lila quietly. "This level of stress and exertion isn't healthy for someone her age. Her body might not be able to handle much more of this." Lila felt a surge of protective panic. Her daughter had been suffering for hours, pouring all of her energy into helping a wild animal she had never seen. The cost was becoming too high, but Lila didn't know how to break the connection without potentially dooming the trapped bear cub. "Can we make her stop?" Lila asked desperately. "Take her away from here?" Elena shook her head firmly. "If you interrupt the communication now, both bears will panic. The mother might attack, and the cub could die from the stress. Your daughter is the only link between the human world and theirs. She's the bridge that's keeping this situation from becoming a tragedy." As if to emphasize Elena's point, Bruno's cries from the chimney suddenly stopped altogether. The silence was more terrifying than his previous distress calls, suggesting that the little cub had either lost consciousness or was too weak to make any sound at all. Zara's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She threw back her head and produced a long, mournful call that was unlike anything she had vocalized before. It was a sound of pure anguish, carrying all the grief and desperation of a creature watching a friend slip away. The mother bear's reaction was equally powerful. She let out a roar that shook the windows of nearby buildings and began attacking the chimney with renewed fury. Her claws tore at the bricks, and mortar dust filled the air as she tried desperately to reach her silent cub. "We're losing him," Dr. Whitmore said grimly. "And I don't think the little girl can survive much more of this emotional trauma." Captain Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. "Captain, we've located a rescue helicopter with specialized equipment, but they're 40 minutes out. Also, the wildlife specialist is still an hour away." 40 minutes might as well be 40 hours, the captain replied tersely. "That cub doesn't have that long." In the midst of the crisis, an unexpected voice spoke up from the crowd. "What if we don't wait for specialized equipment?" The speaker was Thomas Chen, Zara's father, who had just arrived after receiving a frantic phone call from a neighbor. Thomas pushed through the crowd and rushed to his wife and daughter, his face pale with shock at the scene before him. He had left for work that morning expecting an ordinary day, only to return to find his baby daughter communicating with wild bears in what appeared to be a life-or-death rescue situation. "Lila, what's happening?" he asked, taking in the massive mother bear, the emergency vehicles, and his exhausted daughter all at once. "She can talk to them, Thomas," Lila said, her voice breaking. "Our daughter can actually communicate with bears. There's a cub trapped in that chimney, and she's been trying to help all morning." Thomas looked skeptical until Zara demonstrated her ability. His daughter's perfect bear cub call, followed by a faint response from the chimney, left him speechless with amazement and concern. "This is killing her," Thomas said after a moment, seeing the exhaustion in his daughter's face. "She can't keep this up." "But she might be the only chance that Cub has," Elena interjected. "Your daughter has a gift that appears once in a generation. She's the bridge between our world and theirs." Thomas studied the elderly woman with new interest. "You seem to know something about what's happening here. Who are you?" "My name is Elena Vasquez. I've lived in these mountains for 78 years, and I've heard stories about people like your daughter my entire life. The old-timers called them bridge speakers, humans born with the ability to communicate with animals in times of crisis." "That sounds like folklore," Thomas replied, though his tone suggested he was beginning to believe. "Folklore based on truth," Elena corrected. "Your family lived near Whispering Creek before moving here, didn't they? That land has a connection to the old ways, the old magic that most people have forgotten." As the adults debated the supernatural aspects of the situation, Zara suddenly became very still. Her exhausted communications with the bears stopped, and she sat quietly in her mother's arms with an expression of intense concentration. "What's she doing now?" Dr. Whitmore asked, moving closer with her camera. Instead of making bear sounds, Zara began humming a soft, wordless melody. It was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any tune her parents had ever heard her produce. The melody seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, as if she were channeling something ancient and powerful. The effect on the mother bear was immediate. The massive animal stopped her frantic attack on the chimney and sat back on her haunches, her head tilted as she listened to the strange human song. Her breathing slowed, and the aggressive tension left her body. More remarkably, a faint response came from the chimney above. Bruno, who had been silent for several minutes, began making soft sounds that matched the rhythm of Zara's melody. The little cub was still alive, and somehow the human child's song was giving him strength. "She's singing to them," Elena said with wonder. "The old stories mentioned songs that could heal, songs that could bridge the gap between species. I thought they were just legends." Dr. Whitmore was recording everything, knowing that no one would believe this footage without seeing it themselves. "The physiological implications are staggering," she murmured. "Music as a form of interspecies communication, therapeutic vocalization affecting both human and animal neural responses." But even as Zara's song seemed to be providing comfort to both bears, the little girl herself was clearly reaching the end of her endurance. Her small body swayed with exhaustion, and her breathing had become shallow and irregular. Thomas made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'm going up there myself," he announced. "I'm small enough to fit partway into that chimney. Maybe I can reach the cub without waiting for specialized equipment." "Absolutely not," Captain Rodriguez replied firmly. "You're not trained for this kind of rescue, and the structural integrity of that chimney is questionable after the damage the mother bear has done to it." "My daughter is dying trying to save that animal," Thomas shot back. "I won't stand here and watch her suffer when there might be something I can do." The argument was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle. A battered pickup truck pulled up to the edge of the emergency scene, and a weathered man in his 60s climbed out. He carried a canvas bag filled with what appeared to be rope and climbing equipment. "I heard about the situation on my police scanner," the newcomer said, approaching Captain Rodriguez. "I'm Bill Hartley, retired search and rescue. I've done dozens of animal extractions over the years. Mind if I take a look at your problem?" The captain gratefully accepted the offer of experienced help. Bill examined the chimney, the mother bear, and the unusual communication happening between Zara and the trapped cub. His weathered face showed no surprise at the supernatural elements of the situation, suggesting he had seen unusual things during his years in mountain rescue. The cubs wedged about 15 feet down, Bill assessed after listening carefully to the sounds from the chimney. Standard rope rescue. Thomas looked at his exhausted daughter, then at the massive mother bear sitting just yards away, then at the rescue equipment that represented their best hope of saving Bruno. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. "What do you need us to do?" he asked Bill. The rescue specialist smiled grimly. "I need everyone to stay very still and very quiet. And I need that little girl to keep singing her magic song." As Bill began preparing his equipment, an unexpected development caught everyone's attention. A second bear emerged from the forest, an enormous male, even larger than the mother bear. His massive frame moved with the confident authority of the dominant animal in these mountains, and his dark eyes surveyed the human gathering with intelligent wariness. "That's the father," Elena whispered, her voice filled with awe. "In all my years, I've never seen a complete bear family respond to a human call for help." The male bear's arrival changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Unlike the mother, who had shown remarkable restraint due to Zara's communication, the father bear displayed the protective aggression typical of his species. He positioned himself between the humans and his mate, his massive head lowered in a threatening posture. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep in his chest, a sound so primal and intimidating that several firefighters instinctively reached for their equipment. The crowd of onlookers, which had grown to nearly 50 people, pressed backward toward the safety of buildings and vehicles. "Everyone remain calm," Captain Rodriguez ordered, though his own voice carried a note of tension. "Do not make any sudden movements." Zara's reaction to the father bear's arrival was different from her previous communications. Instead of the gentle cooing sounds she had used with the mother and cub, she produced a series of deeper, more authoritative vocalizations. To the amazement of everyone present, she seemed to be addressing the male bear with the respect and formality appropriate for the leader of the family. The father bear's head turned toward the sound of Zara's voice, his ears perked forward with interest. For several long moments, the massive predator and the tiny human child engaged in what could only be described as a conversation. The bear's aggressive posture gradually softened as Zara continued her impossible communication. "She's explaining the situation to him," Elena translated, her elderly voice filled with wonder. "She's telling him that his cub is trapped and that the humans want to help, not harm." Dr. Whitmore continued recording, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "The vocal patterns are consistent with established bear communication structures," she murmured into her phone's microphone. "But the human larynx shouldn't be capable of producing these sounds with such accuracy and emotional nuance." As Zara continued her dialogue with the father bear, Bill Hartley quietly began his rescue preparations. He had dealt with protective parent animals before, but never in a situation quite like this. The presence of both adult bears, combined with the supernatural communication happening between the child and the animals, created challenges unlike anything in his 30 years of rescue experience. "I need to get up on that roof," Bill explained to Captain Rodriguez. "But first, I need to know that both adult bears will remain calm when I start working near their cub." Thomas looked at his exhausted daughter, then at the two massive bears, then at the rescue equipment that represented Bruno's only hope of survival. "Zara's already pushed herself to the limit," he said with parental concern. "I don't know how much more she can take." As if in response to his words, Zara suddenly swayed in her mother's arms. The little girl's face had grown pale, and dark circles under her eyes made her look far older than her 18 months. The supernatural effort of maintaining communication with 3 bears simultaneously was draining her life force in ways that no human child should have to endure. "We need to get her to a hospital," Lila said urgently. "She's going to collapse." "If we take her away now, the bears will panic," Elena warned. "The father might attack, and the cub could die from the stress. She's the only thing holding this delicate balance together." Bill made a quick decision. "I'm going up now, while she can still maintain communication. Every minute we wait makes this rescue less likely to succeed." The experienced rescuer began climbing the ladder that the firefighters had positioned against the building. His movements were slow and deliberate, designed not to startle the adult bears or create any sudden disturbances that might break the fragile peace that Zara had established. As Bill reached the roof level, both adult bears looked up at him with obvious concern. The mother bear rose to her feet, and the father bear took a step toward the building. For a moment, it seemed the rescue attempt might trigger the aggressive response that everyone feared. But Zara, drawing on reserves of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small body, produced a complex series of vocalizations that clearly conveyed reassurance to both adult bears. Her communication seemed to explain that the human climbing toward their cub was there to help, not to cause harm. The bear's response was remarkable. Instead of attacking or fleeing, they positioned themselves on either side of the chimney base and looked up expectantly, as if they understood that they were about to witness a rescue attempt. "Incredible," Dr. Whitmore breathed. "She's coordinating a multi-species rescue operation. The parents are actually positioning themselves to assist if needed." Bill reached the top of the chimney and peered down into the dark opening. The shaft was indeed very narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Using a powerful flashlight, he could see Bruno's small form wedged about 15 feet down, motionless but still breathing. "The cub is alive but unconscious," Bill called down to the crowd below. "I'm going to lower the extraction device and see if I can position it to give him something to climb on." The process was painstakingly slow. Bill had to work entirely by feel, maneuvering the padded hook through the narrow space while trying not to injure the already traumatized cub. Every few minutes, he paused to allow Zara to communicate with the adult bears, reassuring them that progress was being made. But as the rescue attempt continued, Zara's condition continued to deteriorate. Her communications became weaker and less frequent, and her small body trembled constantly now. The supernatural connection that had made this entire rescue possible was literally consuming her life force. "She can't keep this up much longer," Thomas said desperately. "There has to be another way." Elena approached Thomas with a grave expression. "In the old stories, the bridge speakers sometimes had to make ultimate sacrifices to save the animals they communicated with. Your daughter is channeling something much larger than herself." "What are you saying?" Lila demanded, clutching Zara protectively. "I'm saying that this gift comes with a price," Elena replied softly. "The connection between species isn't natural in the way we normally understand it. It requires the human to give part of themselves to bridge the gap." Before anyone could respond to Elena's ominous words, a commotion erupted from the chimney above. Bill's extraction device had successfully reached Bruno, and the little cub was beginning to stir. His weak cries echoed through the narrow passage, indicating that he was regaining consciousness. The adult bear's reaction was immediate and intense. Both parents began vocalizing urgently, their calls mixing with Bruno's cries in a symphony of bear family communication. The sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking, expressing their desperate hope that their cub might finally be saved. Zara responded with what might have been her final communication. Her voice, barely audible now, produced a long, melodic call that seemed to carry all her remaining strength. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, like a lullaby mixed with a prayer, and it had an immediate calming effect on all three bears. "I've got him positioned on the extraction device," Bill called down from the roof, "but he's too weak to climb on his own. I'm going to have to pull him up manually, and that's going to be tricky in this narrow space." Dr. Whitmore looked at her watch and frowned. "He's been trapped for over 4 hours now. Even if we get him out, he's going to need immediate medical attention. I can provide basic first aid, but he really needs to get to a wildlife rehabilitation facility." "The nearest facility is 2 hours away," Captain Rodriguez replied. "But I've already called ahead, and they're preparing to receive a bear cub emergency." As Bill began the delicate process of extracting Bruno from the chimney, Zara suddenly went completely limp in her mother's arms. The little girl's eyes rolled back, and her breathing became so shallow that it was barely perceptible. "She's unconscious," Lila cried out in panic. "Call an ambulance." "There's already a paramedic unit here," Dr. Whitmore replied, waving urgently toward the emergency vehicles. But even as the human medical emergency unfolded, the bear rescue continued above. Bill worked with careful precision, slowly maneuvering the unconscious cub up through the narrow chimney passage. Every few inches of progress required careful adjustments to prevent injury to the already traumatized animal. The adult bears seemed to sense that something had changed. Without Zara's conscious communication to guide them, they became increasingly agitated. The mother bear began pacing back and forth, while the father bear's protective instincts started to reassert themselves. "We're losing control of the situation," Captain Rodriguez observed grimly. "Without the little girl's influence, those bears might become dangerous." Elena knelt beside the unconscious child, her weathered hands hovering over Zara's still form. "She's given everything she had," the elderly woman whispered. "The bridge speakers in the old stories. Some of them never recovered from their efforts to save animals." Thomas felt his world collapsing around him. His daughter lay unconscious, possibly dying, while 50 feet above, a bear cub's life hung in the balance. The supernatural connection that had made the rescue possible might also cost his child her life. "There has to be something we can do," he said desperately. "Some way to help her." Elena looked up at him with sad, knowing eyes. In the stories, sometimes family members could share the burden. Blood relatives of bridge speakers occasionally inherited smaller versions of the gift. "Are you saying I might be able to communicate with the bears?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he found the idea almost impossible to believe. "I don't know," Elena replied honestly. "But if there's any hope of maintaining the connection until the rescue is complete, it would have to come from someone related to her." Meanwhile, the paramedics had arrived and were working to stabilize Zara's condition. Her vital signs were weak but stable, suggesting that she was in some kind of supernatural coma rather than suffering from conventional medical trauma. "I've never seen anything like this," the lead paramedic, Janet Morrison, told Dr. Whitmore. "Her symptoms don't match any standard medical emergency. It's almost like she's drained all her energy and needs time to recover." Above them, Bill continued his painstaking extraction of Bruno. The little cub was now about halfway up the chimney, still unconscious but breathing more regularly in the cooler air. The rescue was succeeding, but time was running out to maintain control of the adult bears. The father bear had begun showing signs of increasing agitation. Without Zara's calming influence, his protective instincts were overriding the temporary trust that had been established. He took several steps toward the ladder where Bill was working. his massive head lowered in a threatening posture. "We need that communication back," Captain Rodriguez said urgently. "If the father bear decides we're a threat, this whole situation could turn deadly." Thomas looked at his unconscious daughter, then at the approaching bear, then at Elena's expectant face. Everything his rational mind told him suggested that what Elena was proposing was impossible. But then again, everything about this day had been impossible. "What do I need to do?" he asked Elena, his voice filled with determination and fear. The elderly woman smiled sadly. "Touch your daughter's hand, focus on the bears, and open your heart to possibilities you've never imagined. The gift might be dormant in you, waiting for a moment of desperate need." As Thomas reached for Zara's small hand, a cry from above indicated that Bruno was nearly free. Bill's voice carried down from the roof. "I can see daylight. The cub is almost out." But the father bear was now only 10 feet from the base of the ladder, his massive form radiating dangerous intent. The delicate balance that had made the rescue possible was about to collapse into chaos, and Thomas was running out of time to discover whether he possessed even a fraction of his daughter's impossible gift. Thomas knelt beside his unconscious daughter and gently took her tiny hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a shock of sensation ran through his body. Not painful, but overwhelming in its intensity. For a brief instant, he felt connected to something vast and ancient, a network of consciousness that stretched far beyond human understanding. Images flashed through his mind: the terror of being trapped in darkness, the desperate love of parent for child, the primal fear of creatures caught between two worlds. Thomas realized he was experiencing the emotions of all 3 bears simultaneously, feeling their pain and confusion as if it were his own. Drawing on instincts he never knew he possessed, Thomas opened his mouth and produced a sound that astonished everyone present. It wasn't as perfect as Zara's bear communication, but it was unmistakably authentic. A deep, reassuring call that spoke directly to the father bear's protective instincts. The massive male stopped his advance and tilted his head, listening intently to this new human voice. Thomas continued his tentative communication, his voice growing stronger with each sound. He was telling the father bear what Zara had been saying all along, that the humans were friends, not enemies, and that they were working to save his cub. The massive male stopped his advance and tilted his head, listening intently to this new human voice. Thomas continued his tentative communication, his voice growing stronger with each sound. He was telling the father bear what Zara had been saying all along, that the humans were friends, not enemies, and that they were working to save his cub. "Incredible," Elena whispered. "The gift runs in the bloodline after all." Above them, Bill's voice rang out with triumph. "I've got him! The cub is free!" Bruno emerged from the chimney opening, small and soot-covered but alive. His weak cries filled the air as Bill carefully lifted him from the extraction device. The little cub was dehydrated and exhausted, but his dark eyes were alert and aware. The reaction from the adult bears was instantaneous and overwhelming. The mother bear rose on her hind legs and produced a series of joyful vocalizations, while the father bear's aggressive posture melted away entirely. Both parents began calling to their rescued cub with sounds of pure relief and happiness, but the most remarkable response came from Zara herself. At the moment Bruno was freed, the unconscious little girl's eyes fluttered open. Color returned to her pale cheeks, and she made a soft, contented sound that seemed to express satisfaction at a job well done. "She's awake!" Lila cried, gathering her daughter into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetheart, you're okay." Thomas continued his communication with the adult bears, as Bill carefully climbed down from the roof with Bruno cradled in his arms. The experienced rescuer moved slowly and deliberately, allowing the bear parents to see that their cub was safe and being handled with care. Dr. Whitmore approached with her medical bag. "Let me examine the little one," she said gently to Bill. 4 hours trapped in that chimney. We need to check for injuries and dehydration." As the veterinarian began her examination of Bruno, something beautiful happened. The mother bear approached slowly, her earlier fear of humans completely gone. She sniffed carefully at Dr. Whitmore's hands and seemed to understand that this human was trying to help her cub. "Mild dehydration and some scrapes on his paws," Dr. Whitmore announced after her examination. "But overall, he's in remarkably good condition. A few hours of rest and some food, and he should be completely recovered." Elena approached the Chen family with tears streaming down her weathered face. "What I've witnessed here today, it's like the old stories come to life. Your daughter didn't just save a bear cub, she brought 2 worlds together in harmony." Captain Rodriguez began organizing the crowd of onlookers who had watched the entire extraordinary event unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give the animals some space. This family needs time to reunite." Bill carefully placed Bruno on the ground near his parents. The little cub was still weak, but he managed to take a few wobbly steps toward his mother. The reunion was tender and touching. The mother bear gently nuzzled her cub, while the father bear stood guard protectively over both of them. Zara, now fully alert in her mother's arms, made one final series of soft sounds toward the bear family. The adult bears responded with gentle huffing noises that sounded remarkably like expressions of gratitude. "She's saying goodbye," Thomas said with wonder, his own newfound ability allowing him to understand the meaning behind the sounds. "She's telling them they're safe now." The bear family began moving slowly toward the forest edge. Bruno walked between his parents, still unsteady but determined to return to his natural home. At the tree line, the mother bear turned back one last time and made a soft call toward Zara. The little girl waved her tiny hand and made a gentle cooing sound in response. Then the bears disappeared into the green shadows of the forest, leaving behind only the memory of an impossible rescue and a connection that transcended every boundary between species. As the crowd began to disperse and the emergency vehicles prepared to leave, Dr. Whitmore approached the Chen family with her phone still recording. "What happened here today? It changes everything we thought we knew about communication between species. Would you be willing to let me document this properly? The scientific community needs to know about your daughter's abilities." Thomas and Lila exchanged glances. They had spent the morning discovering that their daughter possessed a gift that defied all explanation, a supernatural ability that had literally saved lives. "We'll need time to process all of this," Lila said carefully. "But yes, if it can help other animals in the future, we'll work with you." Elena patted Zara's small hand gently. "Take care of this special child," she said to the parents. "Bridge speakers are rare and precious. The old stories say they appear when the world most needs the wisdom to bring different peoples together in peace." As the sun reached its peak in the sky above Millbrook Valley, the Chen family walked slowly toward their car. Zara, alert and chattering happily in her mother's arms, seemed completely recovered from her supernatural ordeal. She babbled in normal toddler sounds now, though occasionally she would pause and tilt her head as if listening to voices that only she could hear. Marcus emerged from his pizzeria, which had been closed during the emergency. "Your daughter saved a life today," he said to Thomas and Lila. "If there's ever anything my family can do for yours, please don't hesitate to ask." "Actually," Thomas replied with a smile, "we were planning to grab some lunch. I hear you make excellent pizza." As the Chen family settled into a booth inside the cozy pizzeria, Zara pointed toward the window that looked out at the now quiet chimney. She made a soft, contented sound and clapped her small hands together, as if celebrating a successful adventure. The chimney stood silent against the blue sky, no longer a prison, but simply part of an old building where something miraculous had occurred. In the forest beyond, 3 bears were reunited and safe, bound together by an experience that none of them would ever forget. And in the pizzeria, a family shared a meal while discussing the extraordinary events of the morning. Events that would become legend in Millbrook Valley, passed down through generations as the story of the day when a human child spoke the language of bears, and brought 2 worlds together through the power of compassion and understanding. The warm aroma of fresh pizza filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of forest pine that seemed to cling to their clothes. Outside, life in the small town was returning to normal, but the Chen family knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. They had discovered that love and empathy could cross any boundary, even the seemingly impossible gap between human and wild animal hearts. As Zara drifted off to sleep in her high chair, exhausted by her morning's work but peaceful in the knowledge that Bruno was safe with his family, a gentle breeze stirred the trees at the forest edge. For just a moment, those with the ears to hear it might have caught the distant sound of a bear cub's contented call, carried on the wind like a whispered thank you from the wild world to the human child who had risked everything to answer a cry for help. The story of the bear cub wedged in a pizza oven chimney had come to an end, but the connections forged that day, between species, between hearts, between the human and natural worlds, would last forever. And in the years to come, whenever someone asked what made this little girl so special, her parents would simply smile and say that sometimes, when the world needs it most, extraordinary children are born with the ability to speak the universal language of love.